There are forced pay cuts, and then there are pay cuts that you choose to take for whatever reason. People think of forced pay cuts as like everybody gets an email and says, you're now making 20% less like they did when the pandemic started. But the reality is there's a lot of slow burn ways to shave payroll costs off the bottom line of a company's balance sheet. Welcome to the Rich and Regular podcast, where we explore life at the intersection of money. I'm Kirsten.
And I'm Julian. And today we're talking about how to know when a pay cut is worth it.
Yes.
It is a big topic. It is a sensitive topic. I want to jump right into it because it is that time of the year. It is officially Q4 and corporate is doing what corporate does.
Yes. Now, it's a less aggressive September surge this year, which we anticipated. But, you know, September is just that time where the vacancies open up and people start hiring again.
Yeah.
And when it comes to pay cuts, I feel like it's a fairly common occurrence, but the advice out there is just either bad or incomplete, meaning it revolves around like always never rules and people take it literally.
Yeah.
Like always, never. And dealing in these times requires a little bit more nuance. The second reason I wanted to talk about this was because some of the trends have started to come out around the pay transparency that's now a thing. Mm-hmm. We talked about this at the beginning of the year in episode 140, but now we're starting to see the trends. Now that it's a law for certain states that they have to reveal, you know, salary bands and all that stuff with the job postings. What the data shows is that 41% of positions are going unfilled because candidates want more than what the company is willing to offer. And then 48% of companies have said that they have reset pay downwards for some of the roles over the past year. So we've got this mix, this power struggle between employees who have been told to always negotiate and they're not willing to take anything less. And then you've got companies who are like, well, this is what the role is now. And so it's a battle.
Yeah. And I am admittedly removed from this. We've been kind of out of the corporate world for a minute now, but obviously we have a lot of friends and family who are caught up in this. And so we also hear anecdotes from them and can, you know, to a certain extent reflect back on some of our own experiences. But this is what I would have likely expected if I were still in the world, right? It was like, all right, you will never completely get what you ask for in the context of an employer or an employee relationship. And so it was like, yes, you're right. We will give you transparency and you're not going to like what you see. And so here's what it is. And, you know, we will still figure out ways to ensure that we remain profitable and that we achieve our corporate goals. It is also layoff season. It's not as bad, it doesn't feel like, as it's been, you know, a few years ago or maybe even earlier this year. But I know pretty recently, this is as of Q4, the beginning of Q4 2024, CVS just announced that they were laying off 3,000 workers for cost-cutting measures, which broke my heart because no disrespect to CVS. You go in that store and it's like, y'all are already cutting corners. Like, it's pretty clear. Samsung announced about 10% of their workforce, which is crazy. Disney, I saw another article. Again, just doing some quick Googles, you know, they were making some layoffs. It feels like they are kind of perpetually doing that, you know, both in corporate and sort of on the ground or in ESPN or in this corner and that corner. They're always kind of making cost-cutting measures. What really caught my eye, and it was concerning because it's such a large company and a very influential one with respect to setting the tone for an entire industry, was Amazon, who did not actually announce layoffs, but they announced their RTO, which is an acronym for Return to Office. And yeah, I wish I had a sound effect. I will play a clip though, because this, you know, again, like in many ways, like I would imagine if you work for a large company, even if it's a somewhat large company, your leaders are inspired by leaders by other companies. They're oftentimes quoting them. And in many cases, they are running the same play, using the same language and approach that those companies, those world-class companies and organizations do. And so this is why we're talking about Amazon in particular, because we know that just a few years ago. Like, they were among the leaders in response to the pandemic to say, hey, we're flexible. We care about our employees' safety, and we understand and trust our employees. And now here they are just a couple years later, sort of reneging on that. And here we are. So according to a memo by the CEO, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but here's a quick little line directly from the Amazon CEO saying that starting on January 5th, 2025, employees will need to return to working in the office 5 days a week in order for the company to deliver the absolute best for customers and the business. Now, obviously, this upset a lot of people. I'll read from a The Street article, which basically was reacting to a survey that was conducted by a job review site called Blind, and the numbers were not pleasing. A couple of them I'll throw out there. One, about 91% of the 2,585 Amazon employees, 91% of them polled, said that they were unhappy with this news. 73% of employees are considering searching for another job due to this new policy, and 32% said that they knew someone who had already quit their job at Amazon, basically immediately upon hearing this news. They were talking about this on the Today Show, I believe. And so I grabbed a quick clip because I think it really surmises how I feel. So here's what they had to say as they were reviewing this and talking about the response according to the Today Show.
Many people have settled into a new way of working over these last several years, some of them actually moving away from the physical place where they work. So can they now be fired for not returning to the office?
Willie, good morning to you. And for most who work at will, yes, you can be fired for not adhering to these policies. Now, unless your contract specifically states a remote option, or if there's a reason coming into the office is unsafe, most employees will have to fall in line or risk losing their job. Now, many experts see these mandates as a way for companies to reduce their workforces by getting people to quit so they don't have to pay severance. Some also suggest if coming in 5 days is mandatory, then try to negotiate in-office hours to help accommodate childcare needs or avoiding those longest commute times. The expert we spoke with says this is also a prime time for recruiters to try and poach workers to join their companies by offering more flexibility.
All right. So there were so many key words there that we are likely going to repeat. The first is at will. If you're unfamiliar with that word, that basically means that in the United States, I'm pretty sure it's all 50 states, it is the law of the land is that companies do not really need a reason to fire you. However, when they do that, in many cases, they do have to offer severance. It is not guaranteed. And it is certainly not negotiable in some cases, though other people will suggest otherwise. She also mentioned the word contract, which a lot of people just do not have. I don't think we really realize that. And so all of that to say, I think that the big thing is that, yes, they can do this. They have always been able to do this. And this is the nature of this relationship. And so this is also why we're talking about this, because this, unfortunately, will be on the table for those who absolutely need the money. A pay cut or accepting lower pay, if this is what is presented to you and you don't really have another option, is something that you likely need to be prepared for. And it's obviously going to have an impact on your financial life. And so that's why we're talking about it today. And hopefully we can help those out who might not be familiar with what these conversations look and feel like.
Yeah, I think the place to start is building off that example. There's really two different types of pay cuts. There are forced pay cuts, and then there are pay cuts that you choose to take for whatever reason. And I think when it comes to forced cuts, it comes in a lot of different flavors. Sometimes it's a pay cut because you were working from home and now you got to return to office, and there are costs that come with your commute. Whether it hits you immediately or whether it comes right out of your check, it's still a cost that comes with going into an office 5 days a week. Mm-hmm. There's other cuts where, there might be a couple of years where nobody gets a merit increase or a bonus. Yes, it's not guaranteed money, but it's absolutely money that you need in order to keep up with the cost of living or in order to make your performance make sense, right?
Like the slow phase out.
Slow phase out.
Yeah.
There are some people whose compensation is based on variables like stock prices or commissions, right? In a world where the stock drops because of overall performance or the sales expectations are lower because of supply chain issues or whatever excuse they give you, then you are going to receive less money because that's just how commission works.
Yep.
There are other cases where if you're a salaried employee and you're stripped of certain responsibilities or pulled off projects, which lowers the perceived value of your role, that's a form of a pay cut. Outsourcing key functions to remote contractors in places where the cost of living is lower. So places like India or Asia, the Philippines, absolutely.
Caribbean.
And then there's other times where it's just obvious. It's your age and tenure that gets you booted. They want to replace you with someone who is younger and cheaper. And this case really isn't just about your salary alone. I know it can feel that way, but the reality is it's also your healthcare costs that are more expensive than a younger employee and any other perks that you might have taken advantage of. If you're grandfathered into a pension or if you have a certain 401k structure that isn't offered anymore, that becomes a part of that decision. And so I think people think of forced pay cuts as like everybody gets an email and says, you're now making 20% less like they did when the pandemic started. But the reality is there's a lot of slow burn ways to shave payroll costs off the bottom line of a company's balance sheet.
It's dare I say it is or can be very devious or disguised. Sometimes it can also look very sexy. So to your point, it can say, you know what, this is going to be the new focus. And it can feel like very out of left field, right? You guys are going to start working more closely with this organization. And again, we've been in so many different versions of this. It's probably a podcast in and of itself, but you start to hear people, at least those that are savvy, that have been around the block a couple of times, starting to peep game. And I feel like we're at that part of our careers and our level of familiarity. And so in part, we're having these conversations, kind of reminding those who may be naturally optimistic, but certainly for those who might be unfamiliar with the kinds of games or the ways that these kinds of things happen, you start to hear them talking about being pushed out or, I think they're trying to make quiet fired a thing, but like this is a part of it. And to your point around like salary transparency laws, I mean, you start to see roles where you may have known someone who was in it and they were making X thousands of dollars. And then that exact same role is posted with like 90% exact job responsibilities, but like maybe 40 to 50% of the cost, right? Like a year later, because
it's not even a year. Like people are laid off from positions. Yeah. It's not hard to find the position reposted online, but for a fraction of the salary.
Yeah.
That's happening right now. That actually happened to me 4 years ago when I left. Like the girl who took my spot, bless her heart, made far less money than I did.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that the PR/spin machine is calling this a reset. So they're calling it a salary reset, the great salary reset. It's very clear that U.S. salaries are falling, but the powers that be, the HR representatives, the communication managers, the consultants who are behind it are saying that it's an effect of oversupply, meaning that there's a tighter labor market, so people have fewer options than they had years before, meaning employees had fewer options to where to work. And it's the whiplash effect. It's the unwinding of the 2021 run-up. We experienced record salary growth and record stock growth in 2021, and now this is a reset. They borrow that language from the stock market. This is just a correction.
I would add that this is also a reflection of AI just being more formally embedded throughout the business.
Absolutely.
And basically eliminating the need for a lot of the work that human beings used to do. And so the more it happens, the more busy work kind of goes away and can be something that is just naturally automated. Everybody gets accustomed to it, and that those responsibilities never come back. And so all of those things and more are why we're kind of being faced with the reality that we might have to accept a pay cut, and hopefully, this conversation prepares some people for it.
Yeah, that's a good word, because there are a couple things that you can do to prepare. And I think the first one is to be open to exploring lateral moves in stable industries. So every industry ain't tanking. There are some industries and growth opportunities in sales and customer service, retail management, analytics, engineering, obviously AI. And the benefit of being open to a lateral move, regardless of what the title is, regardless of like what it's called, what you're doing, the benefit is that you get to see what it's like to actually be the cheaper option. You get to take advantage of training opportunities and you get to learn a new skill. I know lateral moves tend to register with people as taking a step back, but in these times, it's a step back to move forward. It's a step back to reorient yourself with the new way of working because your previous position is being downgraded, downvalued, devalued.
Devalued, yeah.
Downvalued. And then the second thing is something we talk about all the time, which is just to start building your personal brand, start warming up them contacts, reminding people what you're good at. If you're savvy, you can offer some freelance or contract work, but it's really a matter of like testing the water. As uncomfortable as it may be, you don't want to wait until the cut finally happens, because now you're in line with everybody else.
Yeah, I would add to that, spending less time in non-productive, dare I say, useless meetings. And that may seem obvious, but I do know from personal experience, like all across the board, I know, especially those who are in corporate, you may feel like, you know what, I'm just going to keep playing the game, and you think that, well, this is not a useless meeting, or you think that maybe it's just like you sensing that this is one of those busy meetings, but everybody's doing it. And so as a result, maybe it's not. And there are some that are worse. And so I'm not going to complain about it. Be honest, because somebody realizes that it's a useless meeting. But what happens is, because everybody's doing it, it just kind of feels like it's the norm. And so you only really consider like the really poorly managed useless meetings. But a lot of these meetings are just that, like BS, busy, keeping everybody jumping around from one floor to the other, trying to get into these meeting rooms. But like, we all talk about it offline. Let's just be a little bit more honest about it. Spend less time in those meetings, repurpose that time to ensure that you are working on things that are truly productive, ideally measurable, and that are going to be aligned with where you see things are going in the business. You just unplug from the things that are not productive and really start to plug into the things that you believe are. The second thing that I would say, and this may seem a little obvious, but I think that corporate laziness, that fluff, if we're just being honest, can be so contagious that you can think that, well, everybody does it. It just is what it is. It's not a big deal. It's only a big deal if you take like an hour and a half or 2 hours for lunch. But everybody knows that you should come back, after an hour 15, because the elevators are bad and parking and blah, blah, blah. Don't be that person. Like, just do not be that person. And certainly don't be the person that just, even if it's just like a little bit of extra dip on the chip, like, don't be the person, don't make it easy for your boss who might be forced to make a decision. Mm-hmm. Don't make it easy on them to label you as the person who has to fall on the sword and make the deep cut, because it could be that if there's 5 of you on the team, 1 of you has to go and 3 of you have to make cuts, right? Mm-hmm. Like it could be that everyone has to go, or 3 people have to go. Don't make it easy for them to say you. Like, it's always going to be 1 or 2 that's easy, but you want to at least have something on the board, when they're saying like pros and cons, like, is this person worthy of hanging in there or not? Like, don't give them a reason to do that. And it could be anything, like a tendency to just check up on the score really quick on ESPN or, on your work laptop, or to just be late, a while. And everyone understands because I'm the one with the worst commute. And so it's not actually something that works against me. In moments of negotiation, in these brutal times, it is absolutely part of the reason why you might be the person to be let go. And they will shed a tear in the process of doing it, but that doesn't help you because you're the one who actually needs the money. Yeah. And so, just really, really be mindful of your productivity, how you're presenting yourself, and ensuring that you are always not just adding value, but thinking ahead about ways that you can continue to add value to the team or the company. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, like, my list of don'ts is really, really long. Like, we initially started thinking about this in terms of like the pros and cons of pay cuts, but I think this is an absolutely brutal process. And so unfortunately, my list is filled with negative things and don'ts, right? So we're going to get into some do's and some don'ts. And I just want to kind of continue along those lines of like things that you just don't want to take stock in. And I'm saying this because I know so many people who, I wouldn't say feel exempt from these kinds of situations, but they feel protected to a certain extent, feel bulletproof. Like, that will never be me because, and they insert this list of things that they have. And so I'm just going to run down some of the list. The first thing that I tend to hear, and I'll also be specific because I hear this from, and have heard this from several people who are executive assistants. You've got a strong relationship. I've worked with this person for 10 years. I'm telling you, I also have a long list of former executive assistants who can tell you that they no longer work with that director, that leader, that VP, or that chief officer, and they're not in their lives. Like they go from being family to just you're not in their life anymore because they did not, quote unquote, take care of you. Okay. This is the brutal, brutal reality of corporate. And I would advise you think about this very similarly to what we expect professional athletes to do when it comes to being a member of a team. You understand that you're there to add value and that you are appreciated and maybe even beloved by the organization and the fan base, but that does not mean that they won't trade you or just get rid of you or cut you.
Still a business.
It's still a business, right? So along those lines, it could be that, yes, you've been plugged in and you've got your side hustle and all of these things. You just started it last year. And so you're maybe open to a pay cut because things are starting to look up there. I would advise you go back to our book, go back to the chapter on the 15-year career where we talk about you really need, I would say, 7 to 10 years of not just proof of concept, but like proven return and viability of that business. I don't care if it's real estate or freelancing or whatever it is. If you've just started, you really want to make sure that like you're not like overvaluing any of the progress that you made there. And I'm saying that from like personal experience because it can be really, really rough. So don't accept a pay cut thinking that you would make up for it in your new business. If you're not like, I would say minimum, like more than 4 years ahead of the game, like with 4 years of really, really grinding it out, find something else to fill in the gaps because there's going to be some tough times ahead, unfortunately. The third thing I would say is don't take stock in handshake agreements, right? These casual things that make people feel as if this their safety is kind of written in stone because it is sort of a derivative of the idea that there's a relationship there. But when I was talking about relationships, that's very casual. What I think a lot of people do is they have these handshake agreements or, you know, I had lunch. We do lunch once a month with my mentor and they say these things. And as a result, they feel protected and they don't really have to worry about negotiating. Like that does not stand up in court.
Yeah, unless you've literally talked about your salary expectations in that agreement.
Literally.
I've seen a lot of handshake agreements go wrong because people do vibe over lunch and then they realize like, oh, you wanted $160,000?
Right.
We only have budget for 119.
Yeah.
And that's, it's unfortunate because it comes at the end of the process. You thought they understood what you made and what you expected. And
yes,
you had talked about taking on more responsibilities. And now it's like.
But you talked about everything except for the cold, hard numbers, right? And that leads me to the next thing that you should not be taking stock in. And this is probably the biggest thing, but what somebody else made when they were in that role or what you just happened to see or learn. And as a result, what led you to set your eyes on a particular role? Because sometimes that's just not the case. Mm-hmm. It could be that, yes, the last person who sat in that role or who had that team, very similar to the young lady that you said had your role, I'm sure she was very excited. Maybe she did believe that she was going to be earning what you were earning, only to realize that, yeah, you're going to get, it's the same role, but it's not the same role because you're not being paid. You're not going to get the level of support. There isn't the kind of alignment that you have. That organization or project is maybe deprioritized and so on. So every situation, even though it's the same role, same company, same team, same year, is up for negotiation in terms of how that particular role is going to be valued. And so if a pay cut is on the table, you want to make sure that you are being very, very specific, very detailed, and very clear with whoever it is that you're speaking to. Like, don't just rely on vibes. And the last thing I'll say, this is also in relation to Amazon, because there were articles about how not only there was negative backlash from employees, but there was a decline in the stock price in reaction to this decision, because everyone anticipated that, hey, this is something that people believe might actually backfire and lead them to actually not have the kind of year that they believe. And what happens is employees tend to look at the stock price, see the decline, and then believe that leadership, the board, and everyone else that is involved is not going to stand for this. And so they're going to revert it back. And I hate to break it to you, sometimes they completely have planned for it. Like that was also in that clip. They completely planned for it. They knew the moment they went out with that mandate and they were very clear on what they wanted the CEO to say and not say. They were prepared. that 33% of people might already lead. And to their point, they wanted you to go. They wanted to clear you out so that they can recalibrate those roles, reorganize it all, and so on. And so you can benefit from that, obviously, if you are coming into a role where you are making more money. But for those of us who are already in that role, or those of you, I should say, that are already in that role, these kinds of things are done for a reason. And while it is important and they do pay attention to the stock price, it's not the kind of thing oftentimes that will trigger them to revert on something that they publicly going out there, because it is a cost-cutting exercise, and they likely have already baked that into their plans.
Yeah. I'll add a few more to the list of things you shouldn't take stock in. I would say don't take stock in your years of experience, because sometimes that works against you. There are a lot of people who think, well, I got at least 20 years of experience. My pay should be at least at this level. And what I'm saying, what we're suggesting is that it's not about the number of years anymore that matters. That now looks like 20 years of merit increases, 20 years of healthcare, 20 years of this, that, and the other. It's really about the work. It's really about what you've done in those 20 years. Is that still valued the same? If your job has remained largely unchanged for the last 20 years, they are able to prorate your salary back to 20 years ago and put that out in 2024 and say, this is the starting rate, because that's what happened. Like, nothing has really changed. I would also not take stock in severance as a default. I think a lot of people believe that if you're laid off, you're going to get some level of severance. And it's really important that you read your employee manual and learn whether your position is eligible, and understand the laws in your state and the financial situation that your company is in. If they are facing bankruptcy, for example, they don't have no severance to give out. So
they don't have to. They don't have to. Too. Right. And I will also say this with regards to severance. I'm not an expert on these kinds of things. Maybe we'll eventually get an HR expert in there, but I don't see it. They don't have to. If nothing else, it is an employee. It's like a PR thing, right? Where it's like, well, we want to make sure that if these people leave, that they at least are leaving with a bit of an understanding and appreciation of these things, but they just don't have to at all. Now, they do know that if they continue to do that, that they're going to get a bad reputation. And as a result, they aren't going to be able to attract top talent, but that's why they do it. It's not a reward in any sense. And I think, because some people like never really experience what it's like. I've never received severance. I've never been fired, but, I think it's one of the things why we're so unfamiliar with how to negotiate it. We've had these conversations with people, and more often than not, the vast majority of people I know who've been laid off did not get anything.
Yeah.
It's really only been a handful of people at truly reputable companies that have been able to get it. And so don't bank on that.
Yeah. And the last thing I would say to not take stock in, and I know this is going to sting a couple people, but going back to school and getting another degree. I'm going to be honest, none of the most in-demand skills right now are being taught in traditional institutions like that. To lose 4 years of your life when skills and expectations are rapidly changing, the opportunity cost there is just not worth it to me. And you don't know that it's going to fix it. Now, for the highly specialized career paths, I always got to caveat where it's like, I need a degree. Okay, for y'all, ignore this part. But for most people who believe that they want to pivot into marketing, or they want to pivot into, I don't know, whatever your local MBA is selling you on, I wouldn't take stock in the fact that getting a degree is going to be the thing that fixes whatever situation you're in. This is the new way of work. Your ability to pivot, to learn, to what is the word I'm looking for? Reincarnate yourself in terms of your career, reinvent yourself.
Reinvent yourself.
Yes, reinvent yourself is going to be the new norm. Like, this is just where we are as a country. You don't get the luxury of spending 40 years identifying as one thing. You get to be a teacher for 5 years, and then maybe you do freelance for 3, and then maybe you join a training department for another 7. That's what a portfolio career looks like, and that's going to be the new norm.
Yeah, pay cuts. You are in those negotiations and it is presented. We talked long lists of what not to take stock in, how not to think about this.
Well, those were for forced pay cuts.
Well, for forced pay cuts. But I do think that there are a handful of situations where, it kind of makes sense. And I'll even speak from my own experience. I never had to negotiate a pay cut, but I certainly do recall making a decision to go for and to accept a role where I knew that I would not receive pay. So basically a lateral move, and it was a skill-based one. because I wanted to develop the skill that I knew was going to help support me outside of the business, outside of that particular job. At the time, this was towards the latter part of my corporate career. We'd already paid off all the debt, and we'd been investing like well over half of our income. I was preparing for fatherhood and marriage, and we already had a rental property, and we were kind of building Rich and Regular in the background. I was not interested in a job at all. And the company was going through like multiple rounds and rounds and rounds of layoffs. And so I was kind of hoping for a severance, but I knew it would not happen if I were to get tapped, but I never got tapped to be laid off. I was always kind of considered one of the people that there was still a lot of growth potential in and so on. But if it were presented to me in those moments, I would have probably taken it. It would have been fantastic to say, yes, I'll take a pay cut if it means that I only get to come into the office for a couple of days. Because again, I'd already done the work and I'd had years of, experience in building those things. And we were already seeing significant signs. And the plan would have likely been to roll that thing out. I'd have been underpaid for 3 to 5 years and loved it. Those, I think, are the kinds of situations where you want to be. Like, that is when a pay cut actually makes sense, when you can afford it. As weird as that sounds, right?
But it's not just financial. There's also mental.
For sure.
Affording, right? Like, I've definitely opted to take less, not just a lateral move, but
Correct.
to make significantly less because I wanted to move to another state and I wanted to start over in a different industry. And I think the question when you are considering whether to take a pay cut, whether to actively choose to take one, is whether it's worth it. And that's a hard question because there's a lot of unknowns there. There's a lot of things that we hope are worth it, but you really have to do the work to make sure that this is a calculated risk and not just a gamble, right? We've talked about that before on a podcast, but when it comes to jobs and other emotional decisions, a lot of times our hope and our optimism get in the way of actually writing it down and figuring out where the loss is taking place, right? So my first do is to ensure that this is a calculated risk. And the way that you do that is by getting very specific and writing down your assumptions, writing down where you hope that the bonus that you make is going to make up for it. You hope that the cost of living and not commuting is going to make up for less money. You hope that a happier work environment is going to make up for the fact that you have less money coming in. Write all those assumptions down and then create some clear milestones to ensure that you're making progress. You have to check your assumptions on a regular basis. It doesn't mean that you have to beat yourself up if you're wrong about them, but it does mean that you have to remain honest and make sure that you're solid on your motivations and why you did this to begin with. Because again, if you get desperate, if you are motivated by trying to prove something to somebody else or motivated by trying to avoid something that is completely natural in all workplaces, whether it's conflict or, boredom, those are the things that you're going to find wherever you go. And so you have to be clear on your motivations. Now, my don'ts for making a choice about whether to take a pay cut are: don't forget to factor in the non-salary benefits. So health insurance, retirement plans, childcare, all of that stuff has a financial impact. So don't just look at the salary. It is way bigger than the salary. If your health insurance is going to cost 3 times as much at this company, or if your doctor's not in network, but you need to see that doctor, you might break even. And then you'll have to ask, are there other things?
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, don't neglect to create an exit strategy. Ideally, this is a temporary solution. Exit strategy doesn't mean leaving the company. It could just mean moving to a different position in a higher paying role. But you need to make sure that as you're getting into these roles, you're not settling in and creating a new normal when you actually needed the money that you had before.
Yeah. I would also say this. If you can, you should aim to have something in writing, which is really, I would imagine, difficult to do because anyone who is savvy in HR is going to tell you, like, don't do that. In fact, the HR person is going to be so upset at your manager or your leader if they've ever committed to saying anything like that in writing. But I would imagine if you at least have something, even via email, where it's like, yes, I'd love to do that. Here's what I think, somewhere in that ballpark. We don't have to agree, but something like that, where it's like, this is what the pay cut can be, or something that legally gives you some leverage that you might be able to negotiate, because exceptions can always be made. Everything is negotiable, but their job is to reduce cost. And so if you happen to have a spade in your back pocket, which is something in writing, and you are willing to navigate those now borderline legal conversations where you can say, well, the difference between me and everyone else is that I actually have something in writing on this day. My manager or leader said this specifically to me, or verbally, or not verbally, but wrote in this email to me, this is what I could expect. And as a result, this is what I'm willing to negotiate. They will likely come back to you with a yes or a no or something in writing that says, well, that's okay, but now I also need you to sign this document, which says you will not speak or share any of these details, blah, blah, blah. But now,
or they might say that person's no longer here. And so,
well, they can do that, but then you at least, it's up to you now whether or not you want to do it. You know, one of the things that I remember, because my departure from corporate was a borderline volatile one. It wasn't a pleasant one, I should say. And, I've had so many conversations with people who have successfully battled in, or who have successfully won cases against former employers, and they salivate because they're like, oh my God, I would have, you had something there. You should have totally used that. And I just did not want to introduce any of that stuff into my life. That's not the story I really wanted to tell at all. I was more concerned with the story that we're living right now. But it helps. It really, really does to have something, because you are already in such a mismatched, imbalanced relationship when it comes to employers and employees. And so you want to have something that at least gets the legal team or the HR team, because they're oftentimes, pretty much the same group, to say, well, there is a risk here. So what can you do to make sure that you are not putting the company at risk because I have this thing or these things that suggest otherwise? When you might want to accept it, or when it might be cool, is if you have a fully funded emergency fund. Like if you are already sort of climbing out and you're still climbing, you still have work to do, like, accepting a pay cut is not going to help you. It's going to add so much more stress to your life, because you're going to wake up with that stress of what if something happens, you don't really know how you're going to do it. And it just invites a level of stress into your life that I would imagine most people want. And the last one, which may seem a little obvious, is if you've already achieved your retirement goals, if you know that you already have enough, you already hit your coast-fi number, you're already financially independent. Those are the stories that I think when people say that they've accepted a pay cut, I think those are the stories that create this really favorable and idealistic narrative in people's minds, which is why we tend to cozy up to the idea and make it look like accepting a pay cut isn't as bad as people make it seem. But the difference is you're not them. Right? Like they can afford to take a pay cut and still show up early, smiling, and be wildly inspirational because they're already set. But if you're not already set, accepting a pay cut is not going to work in your favor. In fact, those are some of the best employees. The company highlights those people for a reason, but their financial underpinning, their lives are completely different from the vast majority of people. Yeah. And so it's not really comparing apples to apples. And so I'm very clearly biased. For the vast majority of people, this is not an ideal situation. But for the handful that it is, it's likely because they've got leverage, they've got financial cushion, they are financially secure, right? Without those things, like accepting a deliberate devaluation of the value that you provide is just not ideal. And I don't think it ever needs to be presented or wrapped up, coated in sugar and chocolate and sprinkled with anything optimistic. It just is what it is. And it needs to be seen as such.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was definitely the case with us. Like part of the reason we found such joy and motivation in learning to live on half is because we wanted the option to take a pay cut to always be on the table, right? It wasn't a real
that was the goal.
Cut. It wasn't a cut to the white meat. It was just a cut where there was less money coming in, but because we had saved or invested the other half, it was balanced out by the fact that there was this other money growing over here.
Yeah.
This is why we continue to say that your money can work harder than you. You should be able to take breaks and pay cuts and sabbaticals and leaves of absences while your money continues to go to work 24/7, 365. But unless you've built that cushion in advance, the amount of mental and emotional calculus you have to do to make this decision is far greater.
Even as you said that, it just reminded me of all the people that we know who have done that, taken those sabbaticals. And again, it's those people that set the tone in the minds of everyone else, whoever has to have those conversations, into believing that this is what it's like. It's not that bad. Just look at that person. It's like, you are not them.
Yeah.
You are not them.
It's not to say you can't ever be.
Not to say that you can't ever be.
Yes.
Your goal is to become them.
Exactly.
But if you are not them, then most likely a pay cut is not ideal and should not be dressed up as otherwise. The last thing I will say is this, and I've been alluding to it, which is this relationship between employer and employee. This is just another reminder of like the differences between being an employee and being a business owner. Like a business owner can afford to take a loss. There are mechanisms in place by way of taxes that you can leverage to support you or elongate your ability to stay afloat. You do not have those kinds of perks when you are an employee. When you're an employee and you accept a pay cut, you take an immediate burden. You still owe to the same extent. You are also at risk of any debts or anything that you owe continuing to balloon while your income is essentially capped based on this new agreement with your employer. And I think it's just one of those things that really, really supports our call and unfortunately like just contributes to the importance, I think, of entrepreneurship. And everyone says, well, everyone's not meant to be an entrepreneur. And that's fine. I'm not asking you to start a multi-million-dollar tech company, but I do think everyone needs to have the ability to earn income outside of a agreement with an employer that deliberately devalues their labor. You have to have some way to earn income, because when situations like this happen, which I anticipate continuing, because this has always been at the heart of wealth creation, right? The struggle between labor, the haves and the have-nots, the deliberate and forceful, dare I say, violent devaluation of labor has always been a key ingredient in wealth creation. And so this is unfortunately the history of America, and we're not going to get into all of those things now, but this is where we are. I think this is where we're going to continue to be. And I think we just need to continue to empower ourselves to make sure that when these situations arise, we know how to navigate them. We know what not to put stock in and what we should be focused on.
Yeah. That's why they call it the Great Reset. It's just running the same play again. See who wants to do it. All right, y'all. Well, thank you for listening to another episode of the Rich and Regular podcast. There are two types of pay cuts, forced and chosen, and there are two types of podcast reviews, forced and chosen. I hope that you choose to leave a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform so that I don't have to force it. Not that I can do much.
Yeah.
Leave a comment below. Keep the conversation going, and we will see y'all next week. If you like videos like this and want to see more, make sure you click subscribe and turn on notifications.